I fancy doing a second video here where what I'm going to talk about is some of the differences between these sort of grand theories that we've looked at this week, between Huntington, Barber, right, and Fukuyama. Those were the three. Like I said, my reason for the video was that I did see a lot of times, oh, the similarities. And again, I totally take that. I mean, even putting them together, I do think that one thing that they have in common, right, is that they're all trying to predict the future. But these are different futures. And I think one or two of you pointed out that, you know, the Fukuyama one was the most different, perhaps. And I feel, I think that's a fair argument. I think for me, one of the interesting things that I didn't see a lot of when we were discussing Fukuyama is the Hegelian aspect of Fukuyama's argument, right? This idea of, you know, the force of history, right? The force of history is pushing us in this direction, right? And it's pushing us towards what Fukuyama thinks is pushed. It's already pushed us at the end of history. It's pushed us towards. I think I heard Fukuyama's changed his mind on this, but this is still his most famous argument, right? So it's pushed us to this end of history, where there's no longer any history. What it means by there's no longer any history, there's no history in the Hegelian sense. There's no dialectic anymore, right? There's no clashing, and I use clashing because it's a great way to distinguish the clash of civilization. There's no clashing of ideas anymore. There's only one idea left. We found the answer, and it's liberal democracy. So one of the differences, actually this is really more of a question than a comment. Is that different from Clash of Civilizations? Is that different from McWeld versus Jihad, or Jihad versus McWeld? Are there any choices to be made in those other two? Or has it been the force of history that's pushed us to these points for the other three as well, or for the other two as well? The more I think about it, right, the more I talk about it in this video, the more I wonder, is that really a difference, right? What do you think? Is it really a difference? Fukuyama talks about the progress of history. Also, Huntington talks about the progress of history, right? From kings to nations to ideologies to finally to civilizations. Was there human agency in that? Did human beings decide that, or is it some sort of force of history? Right? Remember Fukuyama in his Hegelian argument. It's much more a force of history. It's much more a force, a structure out there. Right? This dialectic, this clashing of ideas that yes, we're sort of a part of. Right? We play a part in, but we're not really responsible for it. And this process has come to an end, right? Which is why we have the end of history now. So we have the end of history. And so we won't see any change in that. Right? And if we don't see any change, of course, the beauty for us, or the importance for us for this Fukuyama argument, this end of history argument, is that if that's the case, then we have to ask ourselves, there can't be a backlash, can there? Can there be a backlash against globalization if, and there's a couple of ifs here, if globalization is in fact this spread of liberal democracy, right? This arrival at the answer, we've all arrived at the answer of liberal democracy, capitalism. We've arrived at that answer, and so what we're going to see now then is everybody adopt that, and so now because there's no counter argument, and there's no what is it? Thesis and is this Hegel? We've got thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Right? It's this process. History is this process of a theory, an anti-theory, putting on the scene and opposition to that, and then out of that clash comes the next stage in history, which then is the thesis, which is then met by the antithesis, there's the clash, and then we're on to the next stage of history. right? And then the antithesis, right? And that's history. That's Hegelian history in a nutshell, right? And so that's what Fukuyama's working with. But what he's found is that we have this final synthesis that doesn't have an antithesis anymore. There's no antithesis left. So history is finished. And so for me, under those circumstances, if he's right? If we take his view, then there can't be another antithesis to globalization. And again, now I'm identifying globalization with liberal democracy, the spread of liberal democracy around the world, which I think we'll see. I think in either this coming week or the next week, we'll see that was talking about that. So that's where Fukuyama takes us. And it's peaceful, I think, that way with Fukuyama. And that's one of the things I think Fukuyama's end of history is, if it's the end of history, there's no clashing anymore. Whereas the clash of civilizations is very much a clash. There's also no argument from Huntington that these civilizational clashes, right, is the end. Right? There's no argument from him that this is the end of history. And so we could evolve away from this in the same way that we evolved from kings and princes to nations, to ideologies, to civilizations. You know, what's the next thing, right, that we could and could it be, you know, the sort of globalization versus anti-globalization? Could that be some form of, you know, the next step? Huntington doesn't again argue that there's an end. There's just a series of steps, and so what's next? Are we in the next one now? Has the civilizational conflict ended? The other way to maybe apply Huntington to globalization is to say, well, is globalized, because he does this in the reading that we read, right? He says that coming together, the globalization, the shrinking of the world, the more we come together, it doesn't make us more familiar with one another, and it does make us more familiar with one another, but it doesn't make us more positively disposed towards different cultures. In fact, it does the opposite. We recognize more starkly the differences between cultures, between civilizations. And so as we do that, now civilizations clash. Does that then, and this is a question, it's a suggestion, I suppose, does that then suggest that Huntington thinks that there can't be a globalization, at least not a globalization in the sense where everybody shares values, right? It shares culture, right? There can't be a monolithic culture. Globalization can't mean monolithic universal culture all over the world, because Huntington says that that's impossible, and he does say that, right? Not necessarily speaking about globalization, but he says that the highest identity that we can, when I say highest, I mean the greatest. The identity that connects us with the biggest number of people. He says the highest you can go is civilization. And he links it to religion. He says you can be, what does he say now? I'm trying to remember the exact quote. But he says, you know, you can be half French and half Arab, I think he says, but you can't be, you know, half Catholic and half Muslim, right? There's no synthesis to borrow from what I was saying earlier, right? With religion, you can either only be one or the other. You can sort of convert between them, right? And it can change the meaning, but you can't, for Huntington, you can't be both at the same time. You're only one or the other. So, so that distinction, that difference, is insurmountable, right? And what does that do to globalization? Does that mean that we can't have globalization? Does that mean we can't have a globalization of universal values or of Americanization, where everybody becomes Americanized? So that's I think a distinction between Huntington and Fukuyama, that Fukuyama has an end and a single end, like a single result. Huntington doesn't have an end, and he also doesn't have it's not peace, right? He hasn't found the solution, right? We've just found the next conflict. And it sort of precludes, I think, Huntington, at least if we're thinking about identity, and the highest identity we can ascribe for ourselves, that there isn't a resolution, there isn't a final common universal value that we all adopt from Huntington. So that's I think a basic difference between the two. Yeah, and then finally with Barber, I find that, Barber seems to change his mind from the beginning to the end of the reading that we do. I think when I read, at first when I'm reading it, I'm seeing Barber as Jihad and McWeld are with us to stay. They're both with us to stay. It's another clash, if you like, and it's a clash that we don't. It's a thesis and an antithesis that doesn't resolve itself, right, into synthesis. That's what I get at the beginning of what he's saying, but I don't get it at the end. At the end, it feels like he says, what is it he says? I'll try and get the quote exactly right. He says something like, as jihad is one last blossoming before the eternal yawn of McWeld, or something like that. Right? Something like that. So it seems like there maybe is a synthesis eventually, but it's not a synthesis actually, because a synthesis is these two. Out of these two, the thesis and the antithesis, comes something new. But for Barber, that's not what's happening. Right? Either we get this continuous clash, which I think he's saying earlier on in the writing, or we get the victory of one of them over the other. Right? And the victory of McWeld, the eternal yawn of McWeld. Sounds great, right? And of course, what that means for us, and what that means for the rest of the course is, it sets up this question: is do we have, if there is a backlash against globalization, are those two here to stay? Right? If one of them, if we say the backlash is jihad and globalization itself is McWeld, do those two things, are they going to be with us forever? Is that where we're going to be? Where we have both sides of it? Does one side really generate the other side? Is there only a need for jihad because there's a McWeld? Right? Is there only a need for McWeld because there's jihad? And do those things depend on each other? Or is this one last? And Barber was saying this back in the 90s, right? So here we are in 2020 now. Is this sort of backlash against globalization, if we agree that there is one, is it one final? I forgot what it is now. One final something before the eternal yawn of globalization of McWeld. So I suppose that's really what I wanted to get out about these three. It might be a little bit repetitive with those first lecture videos that were already posted on here, but I wanted to respond a little bit more directly to some of the things that I've seen in your writing already, and so I hope I've done that a little bit. And I hope that if you have any questions or any comments, that they'll come up in your writing, or that you'll even email me, and I'll be happy to open a conversation with you about any of these topics. Have a great week. Hope you're enjoying the reading for this week, and I'll speak to you later.